Hello, and welcome to the second part of this four-part retreat, where we are together learning more about how the ancient Celtic Church celebrated Advent. Last week, we explored together the importance of the incarnation as the first coming of Christ into our world. Today, in this episode, we will be exploring the second coming of Christ into our own lives. For more information about Br Cassian, who led this retreat for us, visit our website at www.monasticretreats.co.uk/the cloister. May this episode be a place of calm and peace in your Advent season.
So that was last week, the first coming of Christ. So this week, we're going to be looking at the second coming of Christ. And that's not the second coming of Christ that the Bible calls the second coming of Christ, or that modern Christians call the second coming of Christ. That's next week. That's the third coming of Christ. It's a bit like when you're trying to explain a clock to a child or something. You go, well, what's the little hand? That's the hour hand. And what's the other hand? That's the minute hand. And what's the third hand? The third hand is the second hand. No, the second hand is the minute hand. No, it gets a bit confusing. So just try and get into your head these three comings of Christ. And the second coming is actually Christ coming into our lives. And that's what the focus for tonight will be. That's what the focus for the Celts was during this period as well. Christ coming into our lives. We're going to pause in a little while and have a bit of a contemplation, a bit of a small, quiet moment. And then I'm going to read towards the end, I'll read some of the Celtic Advent book as well. I'm going to read today's because that leads well into going into next week. But for the first part, I'm just going to share some thoughts on this second coming of Christ and pulling some bits out of the Celtic Advent book, of course. So in the church that I was brought up in, so my story is that I was born into a family that went into a pretty conservative, fundamental evangelical church. And I left when I was a teenager. But in that church, I was taught that you had a moment in your life where you invited Jesus into your heart. And then that moment shifted and changed your life entirely. In fact, the teaching I was given was that before that moment, I was off to hell. And after that moment, I was off to heaven. Because that moment, what many Christians or many churches call conversion, that moment where you become a Christian, which is a very badly termed phrase, is the moment where you invite Jesus into your life. And that's it. After that, it's about learning what the Bible says. It's about learning how to be a good Christian and implementing that and putting it into practice, which is a little bit what I still think. However, the coming of Christ into my life may have had a first time, but it then has repeated times. And this is how the Celts understood it as well. It wasn't a one-off moment in life where Jesus came into your life and then everything changed. Actually, there was a first time, but the change is gradual. The transformation is gradual. Paul makes this really clear in his letters, that you're being transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the renewal takes time. And in one of his letters to the Corinthians, he talks about the Spirit working in us being like someone cleaning a mirror. And as you clean the mirror, you become better reflections of the divine glory. It's 2 Corinthians 3:18, where in Paul's day, of course, a mirror was usually a polished piece of metal, not a nice piece of glass with a flattened piece of tin foil behind it, which is a very good reflection. It was probably more likely to be a polished piece of metal for most people. And of course, if the metal is left and unkept, it becomes very tarnished and rusted. And if you've ever had any brass things, or if you've ever worked in a pub or something, you know you have to polish the brass to keep it shining. And it's a regular occasion. And that's how Paul describes the work of the Spirit in us. So this becoming Christian is a slow transformational journey. And it's a slow transformational journey because we can't become something different overnight. That's just how it works. It's slow, it's transformational. We have to be careful. We have to be gentle with ourselves. We have to be patient with ourselves. We're not going to be Christ-like, which of course is what the word Christian means, instantaneously. So one of the ways that the Celts understood we could put this into a daily practice is actually invite Christ to be a part of what we're doing on a very regular occasion, daily at least, probably more likely in every moment, in everything we do. So for the Celts, there was no separation between sacred and secular and physical and spiritual. One of the teachings that came from the Latin church fathers, particularly Augustine of Hippo, was this separation, this dualistic understanding of sacred and secular. But for Celtic Christians, as is the case with most indigenous spiritualities, that was a bit of a nonsense. This dualistic thinking was a bit of a nonsense. Everything for them was spiritual. So being on your knees in the prayers and being at the altar taking Eucharist was equally as spiritual as working the fields and working the loom, or carving the stone, or whatever it is that you did for a job. This idea of the separation of asking a question such as "How's your spiritual life?" would have been a nonsense question to them, because everything was spiritual. We have this wonderful collection of prayers and songs and things in a book called the Carmina Gadelica. Don't know if you've ever come across that. If you're someone who has any Celtic prayer books on your bookshelf, if you look in the reference section, I can guarantee that probably at least 40% of what's in your Celtic prayer book probably came from the Carmina Gadelica, which is lovely, but isn't very old when we're comparing it to kind of historic Celtic spirituality and Christianity. So the Carmina Gadelica, which is just a Latin phrase, which the Carmina means the song and Gadelica means of the Gauls or the Celts. So Carmina Gadelica as a title just means the song of the Celts. The Carmina Gadelica is a collection that was created around the end of the 19th century and first published in the beginning of the 20th century. First published version of it was in 1900 or 1901. And a chap called Alexander Carmichael wandered round the islands and highlands of Scotland over the end of the 19th century, collecting a lot of what up until that moment was just oral tradition and oral songs that have been passed down from generation to generation, of these kind of Celtic songs and prayers and incantations and poems and stuff like that. However, because most of them were oral tradition, they can't be proved to be any older than maybe 2 or 3 generations. So he may have spoken to a very old person and they said, well, I remember my grandparents telling me that their grandparents told them this prayer or song. So maybe 200 or 300 years, we can say that these songs came from, but nothing older than that. So it's quite modern in comparison to 4th, 5th, 6th century. We're talking just 200 or 300 years before that, so about 300 or 400 years from now. But what we do know from the original sources from the 4th, 5th, 6th century is that what's in the Carmina Gadelica certainly reflects well the spirit and the attitude of those early Celtic Christians. So we can fairly strongly guess that even if they didn't sing the ones that are in the Carmina Gadelica, they probably would have been singing and praying very similar ones. And in the Carmina Gadelica, it has prayers and it has songs and psalms about things like creating a fire in the hearth in the morning, about putting it out at night, about making your bed, about working the loom, about shearing the sheep, about sowing the seeds and harvesting the crops, and all of these things. And it says stuff like, God with me while I'm doing this, and I'm doing this for the Trinity and that sort of thing. So we know that for at least the people in the Carmina Gadelica, and we see this reflected in the theology, at least, of the ancient Celts, that there was a real sense of that divine presence in the very mundane, run-of-the-mill practice and act. And this sense of using a prayer around each one of those was a sense of inviting Christ into those moments, the coming of Christ into our everyday life, not just that moment of conversion, whatever your theology on that is, but actually Christ coming into our life on a regular, daily, moment by moment basis. Now, we all know, in our heads at least, that God is everywhere all the time. God is always present all the time. But our awareness of that wanes and waxes, depending on how conscious we are. And the purpose of these prayers was to try and make us more continually conscious of that divine presence, so that we were more consciously aware of God with us all the time. And this practice can be done in various different ways. There is much later than the Celts, a 17th century monk called Brother Lawrence, who you may be familiar with. He was a Parisian monk, and he is famous for what's now known as the practice of the presence of God. It's a book that I think every Christian should have on their bookshelf. And if you don't have the practice of the presence of God on your bookshelf, then this is an excellent version to get. This version is translated by Carmen Butcher. It's a brand new translation. It only came out in August this year. She's translated it into the spirit of what he was saying. So if you don't have one, then Carmen's copy is very good. Carmen's translation is very good. But what the practice of the presence of God was, and this is what the Celts did, but Brother Lawrence explains it much better 1,000 years later, is a practice where he was habitually aware of that divine presence all the time. Now, Brother Lawrence was a cook in his monastery. He wasn't the abbot. He wasn't in charge of prayers. He wasn't the prior. He wasn't a guest master. He was a cook. He was a baker in the kitchen, a very busy place to be, with lots of demands, lots of work, lots of noise. But he practiced an awareness of that divine presence. And how he says he did that is that he put in a series of practices. Firstly, he says in his morning devotions, each day, he would remind himself cognitively that God exists and God is here. And then he would go into his day and his daily routine with that awareness in his cognitive brain. And as he did the acts, every single act, he would say a prayer before it and a prayer after it. The prayer before it being something like, God be with me as I'm kneading this dough. God be with me as I'm putting the bread in the fire and in the furnace, in the bread oven. Just like we see in the Carmina Gadelica. And then afterwards, he says, when he'd done that task, he's finished kneading the dough, he takes the bread out of the oven, he looks back on that act and says to himself, how aware was I of that divine presence while I was doing that thing? And he says, if I was aware of that divine presence, I thank God for his presence and then move on to the next thing. If I realized that I'd done that practice and my brain had wandered and I wasn't aware, I repent and go, sorry, I missed that awareness, and get on with the next practice. Very simple understanding of saying, it's like a mini examen if you've done that. You look back and go, how aware was I of God's presence? If I was, brilliant. And if I wasn't, let's try again. And by that practice, he says, that was difficult at first, but became easier. He became so aware of that divine presence that he says that it would be as difficult for him to be not aware of the divine presence in every moment as it was difficult for him to be aware when he started the practice. He says it's hard to start with. You've really got to work at it. But then by the time he was being spoken to by these friends who wrote down the practice of the presence of God, he said, I couldn't not be aware of that divine presence because I'm so practiced at it. And so this is what the Celts were doing when they were praying about the mundane, everyday things. They were putting in that practice. They were, well, I've called it the coming of Christ into our lives. Actually, a more accurate statement would be raising our awareness of the omnipresence of God. Because the Christ being in us and Christ being in the things that we do and Christ being present doesn't change. What changes is our awareness of it. So it's actually raising our awareness of the divine presence. And I want to read a couple of things from the Celtic Advent book, from this section, the second coming of Christ. And then I want to play a song as well. So I'm going to read one bit from the Carmina Gadelica in a moment. And then before that, though, I'm going to read something that comes a little bit earlier. One of the examples of knowing that the Celts had this idea previously, and I can see at least one person with the book in their hand. So if you want to follow along, I'm reading from December 3rd. So no spoilers because you've done this one already. And it's what's called the Prayer of St. Patrick, or the Breastplate of St. Patrick, St. Patrick's Breastplate, something like that, or the Lorica Prayer sometimes. Now, although it's called St. Patrick's Breastplate, the likelihood is it wasn't written by Patrick. Historically speaking, linguistically speaking, how it's written is probably about 300 or 400 years later than when Patrick lived. But it was probably dedicated to Patrick, and that got a bit confused in the translation somewhere along the line where it became known as Patrick's Prayer. But right in the middle, so Patrick's breastplate is about God protecting Patrick. But right in the center of this prayer, kind of the bridge, if it was a song, is this statement here, this verse here that says, Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet and Christ in danger, Christ in the hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. So you can see there that idea of Christ being in everything around you and in you and all those sorts of things. Christ with me and within me and behind me and before me and beside me. If we prayed this prayer regularly, if we used this little stanza maybe as a mantra, then I think we would become much more habitually aware of that divine presence. Even if we started our days with it, or we started points in our day with it, we would become much more habitually aware of that divine presence within us. Over the page on the 4th of December, we have a verse from one of the prayers from the Carmina Gadelica. It comes from a prayer called God's Aid. And it says this: God to enfold me, God to surround me, God in my speaking, God in my thinking, God in my sleeping, God in my waking, God in my watching, God in my hoping, God in my life, God in my lips, God in my hands, God in my heart, God in my sufficing, God in my slumber, God in mine ever-living soul, God in mine eternity. So again, we see this sense of, God is being invited into everything. God in sleeping, God in waking, God in my lips, God in my hands. So all of the elements of life and doing and being in life, this prayer from the Carmina Gadelica is inviting God to be in that space. And this is something we can do very regularly. We can invite God into that space. And I then go on in the same day, December 4th, to quote some lyrics from a more modern song. So that was a song from the Carmina Gadelica, so a song from 150 years ago, or maybe a few hundred more than that. But there's a more modern song by songwriter Tim Hughes, which some of you may be familiar with, called Everything. And if he hadn't just read the Carmina Gadelica before he wrote this song, then there's some kind of spiritual thing going on here, and perhaps even Patrick's breastplate, as I suggest in this day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the lyrics, and then I'm actually going to play the song for us. And what I want to do is, after the song has happened, I want us to go into a short period of silence and reflection. I mean, it's not really a song that generally leads into reflection. It's a bit goey and loud and guitar-y, but we're going to go into a time of reflection. And what I want you to reflect on is how practiced are we at being aware of the divine presence in our mundane, routine, everyday practices? And if we're not very, don't condemn yourself, like Brother Lawrence, don't condemn yourself, just go, so how can I be? So after the song, we're just going to a few moments of quiet reflection, and reflection is, how aware am I usually? And if it's not very, then how can I become aware? I'll read the lyrics first, and then I'll share the song. So it says this: God in my living, there in my breathing, God in my waking, God in my sleeping, God in my resting, there in my working, God in my thinking, God in my speaking. Be my everything. God in my hoping. There in my dreaming. God in my watching. God in my waiting. God in my laughing. There in my weeping. God in my hurting. God in my healing. And his chorus is Christ in me, Christ in me, Christ in me, the hope of glory. You are everything. So let's just listen to that song for a moment and then go into a few moments of silence, contemplating and reflecting on how well and how much we are aware of that divine presence. God in my living, there in my breathing, God in my waking, God in my sleeping, God in my resting, there in my working, God in my thinking, God in my speaking, be my everything, God in my hoping, there in my dreaming, God in my watching, God in my waiting, God in my laughing, there in my weeping, God in my hurting, God in my healing, be my everything. Christ in me, Christ in me, Christ in me, the hope of glory. You are everything. God to enfold me, God to surround me, God in my speaking, God in my thinking, God in my sleeping, God in my waking, God in my watching, God in my hoping, God in my life, God in my lips, God in my hands, God in my heart, God in my sufficing, God in my slumber, God in mine ever-living soul, God in my eternity. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. Mysterious, unfathomable God, may I live in the awareness of your presence every day. As I go about my everyday, may I know the presence of Christ in me, my hope of glory. Amen.